Today's daf is daf mem gimel, and as we saw in daf mem beis amid beis, there's a brisa, a complicated brisa, which Rav Sheshes wants to take apart because the complications are whether or not we're dealing with a prohibition against creating images or situations in which we find the images and we're not sure if they were worshipped or not. And in the last year, we broke up the brisa into three different parts, and we analyzed that in at least two out of the three of the segments of this brisa, the subject is somebody who finds an object. There was a decoration on the object, and we're not sure whether or not it was worshipped. And the brisa seems to say that it depends upon whether or not he saw tsuros of the celestial beings, the sun and the moon and the like. However, with regard to finding a utensil that has a picture of a dragon on it, the Gemara says, "Hani in tsuras drakon lo." So here on the top of Mem Gimel, the Gemara is medayek from the language of the Brisa that the only prohibition if you find a kli is when you have engraved in the kli images of celestial beings, but not an image of an earthly being like a dragon. So when the Brisa prohibits the figure of a dragon, it can't be referring to this kind of construction, el pshita b'motze, and therefore we came to the conclusion that he finds these utensils, they're decorated with figures, and the Brisa is lenient and is matir in the cases of utensils decorated, but not in the case of a dragon. So, for example, if you have, let's say, a fish or a snake that was, you know, embedded in this kli, then that would be potter. So that's a case of motzi. Ukidisnan, and the Gemara now quotes a Mishnah here, our Mishnah here, to support this position. Amotzi kelim and aleim tzuras chama. So if you find decorations on the utensil that you found, and it's either a picture of the sun, the moon, or a figure of a dragon, then in all those cases, it's Asur Bana, it was assumed to have been worshipped, and you have to throw it into the Yam HaMelech. So it comes out now that Reisha v'Seifa b'motzi, that both the opening clause of this brisa and the last clause of the brisa are addressing the case where he found objects. However, b'mitziyasa, the middle case of this brisa is biosa, is talking about whether or not you're allowed to make such depictions on kalim, because the Torah says lotasun iti, and there's an iser of asiya. So Amar Abai says that's not a problem. I can understand the brisa and break it down into those three parts. Reisha v'Seifa b'motzi. The first part of the brisa and the last part of the brisa are dealing with the iser of hana from a kli that was once worshipped, and whether you have to get rid of it and throw it into the Yam HaMelech, umitziyasa biyosa. But the middle clause of this brisa is not addressing a question where you found a kli and you try to determine if it was worshipped or not, but rather the question of whether you're allowed to make these depictions on a kli. So that's Abaye, and Abaye is very, shall I say, comfortable and complacent with breaking the brisa down into those parts. But Rav is not happy with that. He wants to see an integrity in the brisa, and therefore he says kula b'motzi, meaning that even the middle section of this brisa is dealing with a case where you found objects. However, we have to introduce the Shita Rabbi Yehuda, Umitziasa Rabbi Yehudahi. So the middle section of this brisa reflects the Shita Rabbi Yehuda, who is very machmir in the case where he found a utensil, and what he found on the utensil was a figure, a picture of a human face. Tisanya, we learned in a brisa, Rabbi Yehuda Mosif aft mus menika v'sar apis. So we're talking about two different types of images that you found on this kli. And these are not images of the sun, the moon, the celestial spheres, or of a dragon. And yet the Brisa prohibits them and assumes that they were worshipped. What are these two images? Both are images of a human figure, but one is a nursing mother and the other is a prince. And the nursing mother, I mean, it sounds so Christian, but anyway, the nursing mother is Al Shem Chava. Now, Chava was Aim Kol Chai. She was the mother of all creation. And Sheminika Kol Ha'olam Kulo. So she nurses the entire world. And this depiction, which symbolizes Chava, was used by the idol worshippers as part of their idolatry because they saw the idol as a god, as a deity over the entire world. And Sar Apis, the word Sar meaning a prince, and Apis is somehow a reference to the word Mapis. And the word Mapis means lefayes. Lefayes means to pacify. And this is a symbolic representation of Yosef HaTzadik. So interesting how the idol worshippers knew the Bible. And Yosef was Machalkeles HaOlam, right? He sustained the entire world during the 7 years of famine that followed the 7 years of plenty. And the word Sar Apis means Shesar Umafis es Kol Olam Kulo. On the one hand, he's a prince because he was appointed as the Mishnah Melech by Pharaoh, the second in command. And on the other hand, he's a Mafis es Kol Olam Kulo, right? He basically satisfies the entire world by providing them with sustenance. So that now, according to the Mitziasa, the middle part of this brisa, reflecting the Shita Rabbi Yehuda, there are human figures on a found utensil that indicate that it was worshipped, that this utensil was worshipped. Therefore, we have to throw it out into the Am HaMelech. The Gemara qualifies now Rabbi Yehuda's chumrah, and the Gemara says, "V'hu did nakid griva v'kakayel, v'hi did nakta ben v'kamenika." So it's not just a figure of a prince or a figure of a mother, but rather it's got to be a prince that's measuring things out, like a scale, because that's what Yosef had to do. He measured out food for all the people who came on waiting online to get food from him. And unless there's that second indication that this is what we called Sar Umapis, Apis, then we don't know that this was really a symbol of Yosef. And in the case of a picture of a mother, she has to be depicted as nursing a woman so that we know that she's nursing the entire world and therefore she should be worshipped. Now, with regard to the drakon, the dragon, both the Mishnah and the Brisa hold that Tanu Rabbanan Ezu Tzuras Drakon, when the Rabbanan said that if you see the tzura of a dragon, then it's prohibited. You assume it's a deity that they depicted on the utensil and they worshipped it. Piresh Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar kol sheyesh lo tzitzin bein prokov. So again, the way they envisioned this and depicted this dragon was that it had fins between its vertebrae, meaning it was a half dragon, half fish. Machvi Rabbi Yossi ben Pirkei Tzava. Rabbi Yossi pointed to the vertebrae around his neck, right, to show exactly what Reb Shimon Elazar had in mind. Amar Rab Chama b'Rabbi Chanina, halacha Reb Shimon Elazar, and we're going to pass like Reb Shimon Elazar that it's not just a picture of a dragon, but there has to be like a connection between this reptile and a fish. Omar Rab Bar Chanam Rabbi Yishmael. Pam Achas, the Gemara tells a story with regard to this figure of a dragon that once Rabba testifies that Hayisi Mahalach Acha Rabbi Lozer Akapa Beribi, Ribi is the name of a place, or maybe it's the name of Rabbi Lozer, Baderech. So I was behind Rabbi Lozer Akapa on the road. Umatza Sham Tabas. He picked up a ring. V'aleh tzuras drakon, and on the ring there was an engraving of the figure of a dragon, and therefore you're not allowed to have hanor from it. You assume that this was part of the idol worship. So what did he do? Motza oved kochavim katan. He found a young idol, child who was an idol worshiper. V'lo amalo klum. He didn't say a word to him. The Gemara is going to derive a few conclusions from this story. Matza ove kocham gadol, but when he found an older person who was an idol worshiper, and he could appreciate the idolatry, then Amrlo Batla, he forced this idol worshiper to declare that it's batal. And we said before on the previous daf that one guy could be mavatal the Avoda Zara of another. So this idol worshiper refused to do so. He didn't want to, denigrate this ring that had a picture of a dragon on it and was apparently worshipped. Lo butla sasro ubat. So Velazar Kafar gave him a smack until he finally agreed to be mavatal. So the Gemara says, Shema Min Tlas, we're going to derive three different conclusions from this story. Number one, Shema Min Ovid Kochav Mevatel Avodas Kochavim, that we said that one Ovid Kochavim can nullify the Ovid Kochavim of another Ovid Kochavim, Shalom V'Shal Chavero. Shema Min number two, Yodea B'Tiv Shal Avodas Kochavim, U'Mishamshem Mevatel, V'She'eni Yodea B'Tiv Ovid Kochavim U'Mishamshem Mevatel. The reason why Rabbi Elazar HaKapar waited till he got to a more mature, aged idol worshiper to ask him and force him to be mevatel is because the minor, the child, cannot be mevatel. He doesn't know. He's not Yodea B'Tiv Avodas Kochavim. In other words, he doesn't understand the deeper meaning of Avodas Kochavim, U'Mishamsha and its accessories, and therefore he's not a bar hachi. He's not a gavra who can be mevatel. Shema Mina number three, Ove Kocham Mevatel Bal Korcha. Even if you force an Ovid Kochavim to declare that this is batel, it's no longer an idol, and it doesn't have any demand on us to worship it, that declaration is chal, and it's legally binding, and it creates a bittul, because Rabbi Elazar Kappa forced the idolater to nullify it. But the Mordechai here has a very interesting shita. He doesn't believe that just a declaration that's made under duress could have any legal implications, but rather what Rabbi Elazar Kafra did, he forced this idol worshiper to chop off a piece, to partially destroy the idol, and that already is kind of a reality. It's not just an oral mental state of mind, but it's a reality, and a guy could do that, and his Maisa Bittel is valid, it's chal, even though he did it under duress. Now the Rishonim have another kasha here. Why didn't Rabbi Elazar Kapper simply find a Jew who would be Mavatal, make, declared Bittul. So the Gemara could have derived from here the conclusion that only a Goy could be Mavatal, not a Jew. Megadif Bar Reb Chanina. Reb Chanina heard this story and he didn't understand, he didn't appreciate Rabbi Elazar Kapper. He said, Leslie, the Rabbi Elazar Kapper Beribi Hadisnan? Is Rabbi Elazar Kapper oblivious of a Mishnah that says Amatzil? Now, this Mishnah is in Bav Metzia. Or it might be a brisa. Okay, there's a whole discussion here. You save someone's animal from a lion, or min adov from a bear, min anomer from a leopard, min agayis, or from troops that are about to, take your sheep away. Umin anor, or a river that's about to inundate and destroy your flock. Umizuto shalyam, or from being taken out to the high seas by a wave. Umishiluso nor, or even the surge of a flooding river. Or hamotzi bisratya flatya gedol, you find an object which is in a major thoroughfare, and therefore you give up, the person who lost it gives up hope. He doesn't have a chance in a million of finding it. Ubechol makom sharab mitzvah, for any public place. Harelu shalo, you found it, is finders keepers. Why? Mipnei shabayla misyashim emenu, they give up hope. So let's say, for example, in the case of Rabbi Elazar Kapor, this is the argument of Rabbi Chanina, he found a ring, and presumably he found a ring in a public place. If he found a ring in a public place, in the very moment he lifts it up, Rabbi Elazar Kapor now possesses the ring. He's Kodim in a Yesh. Yesh is Hefker. In all these cases of an object that's about to be lost or was actually lost in a public area, then as soon as the Jew picks it up, he acquires ownership of it, and therefore he cannot be Mavatal. And not only that, the guy can't be Mavatal either. Omar Abaye, Nehi de Minach Miyayish Meisura Mi Miyayish. Memar Omar, Iya Ovid Kalchovim Mashkach La, Miflach Polach La. Yisrael Mishkach La, Aidi Domer Yikorim, Mizaben Lo Liovid Kalchovim Upolach La. Okay. So this is a long-winded presentation here of Abaye. We'll try to take it apart piece by piece. Abaye is saying, and I'm going to use the Brisker famous terminology of Tzvei Dinim, there are two different dimensions to the halacha. One is Yeush with regard to ownership of mammon, monetary ownership. But the object in this particular case, let's say the ring, for example, that has a tzura of a dragon on it, there's another category or another name in halachic terms to that ring. It's not just worth, whatever it's worth, $100 on the market as a piece of mammon, but it's also a hefted di surah, because once it was worshipped, it gains the status of avodas kochav. Comes along Abai and he says that although Yeush could be mafkia the shem bailim, in other words, you lose your status as an owner of the object once you're misyayish, but that Yeush does not undermine and nullify the shem iser, which is the shem avodas kochavim. It was worshipped and it has the shem iser. It's what we call a heftzah d'isura. And Yeush could not remove the status as a heftzah d'avodas kochavim. Because if an oved kochavim will find this ring, no doubt that he will worship this ring. So as far as Yeush is concerned, Yeush doesn't in any way block or undermine the status of avodas kochavim, since that ring, once worshipped, will always be worshipped. And therefore, let's see what happens over here. The guy realizes that his ring, his idol, is missing. He says to himself the following: if another idol worshiper will find this ring, there's no question that he will worship it. And not only that, if a Jew finds this ring, then he realizes that this ring has extra value on the market, because if he sells it in the market of idolaters, they'll pay, it'll command a high price. Why? Because he'll sell it to a guy. The guy will look at the ring. He'll identify it as the dragon of his god, and therefore he'll worship it. So he'll pay a lot of money for it. So, in other words, the owner of the idolater who owns this ring, although he gives up hope of finding the ring, but he doesn't remove his mental intention that this ring, wherever it is on the face of the earth, and no matter who finds it, whether a Jew or a guy finds it, is still a deity. And therefore, Rabbi Lazar Kapar felt that since the Shem Avodas Kochavim is still chal, is still valid, then bittul will work. Meaning, Rav Chanina objected. He said, well, there was Yeush. The owner of the ring despaired of ever getting back his ring. The Jewish person who found the ring, in this case, Rav Lazar Kapar, therefore acquires ownership, and there's no bittul. Says the Gemara, nay, the bittul now has to be bittul in the context of Avodas Kochavim. And the laws that will govern this bittul and its validity will depend upon the laws of Avodas Kochavim. It's not that the Jew possesses in Dine Momenos, and therefore the halacha and the status of Avodah Kochavim is changed. No, the status is not changed. And therefore it's still subject to bittul. Hence, Rabbi Lazar Kapor found a guy and forced him to be mevatel. Tanan Hasa. Now we're going to learn a Mishnah at the end of Masechta Rosh Hashanah. And what does it say over there? Dmus suros levanos hayolo Rabbi Gamliel. Wow. Rabbi Gamliel himself, the great Rabbi Gamliel, had depictions of the shapes of the moon, the various shapes of the moon during the, representing the different waxing and waning of the moon during the month. And Bal Yosef B'Tavla B'Kosel, he actually had it engraved in a tablet that he kept on the wall in his attic. And what did he do with them? Shebahem mares haidiotos v'omer lehem kozeri isim o kozeri isim. When he had two witnesses who came in to testify in front of the Beis Din that they saw the new moon, he would ask them, well, what did you see? And he had depictions of the different states of the moon. Now the question is, we just finished saying that lo sasun iti, etc., that you're not allowed to create these images of the moon. So how was he permitted in doing so? Mishari, how could he be permitted? You're not allowed to make images of those who serve me up in the celestial spheres, including the moon. Omar Abai says, Lo osra Torah el shemesim el shamoshim she'efshal lasos kimosa. The Iser of Losasun Iti only applies to parts of the Beis Hamikdash which can actually physically be duplicated. So today, we have technology in which you could take a photograph of the moon itself, or telescopes and so forth and so on. But basically, you cannot create with your two hands an exact replica of the moon. There are parts of the Beis Hamikdash, on the other hand, that you could actually duplicate. And that's what Abai tells you here. Kirisanya, the Brisa says, Lo yasa odom beis tavnis heichal. So tavnis heichal means the sanctuary in the Beis Hamikdash. So you're not allowed to create a duplicate of that. This reminds me, by the way, of the Gemara in Krisus, that you're not allowed to create a duplicate of the Ketores. And Ach Sadra Tavnis Ulam, right? There was an Ulam which connected the Mizbeach to the Heichel, and they had a some sort of like an open pavilion, And a person went ahead and he wants to create a duplicate of this pavilion, like it was in the form of the ulam. Or chater, he wants to create from his courtyard the exact measurements of Tavnis Azara, right? Of the Azara in the Beis Hamikdash. Shulchan, he decides he's going to hire a carpenter to create a shulchan, Tavnis shulchan, and it will be exactly a duplicate of the shulchan in the Mizbeach, in the Beis Hamikdash, which we could do. Menorah. Okay, here we're going to get into a whole discussion whether the menorah is made of gold or made of silver and so forth and so on. But let's assume the menorah was made of gold in the first temple. Beis Hamikdash Harishon, they had a menorah of Zav, and he decides he's going to create an exact duplicate of the menorah. With 7 candelabra made out of gold. And in all these cases, he violates the Isur of lo ta'asuniti. In other words, don't make like something with me, something that is mine in my bias, in my home in the Beis Hamikdash. But the Torah doesn't prohibit anything that's different from being an exact duplicate of what was in the Mikdash. For example, he makes a menorah shel chamisha, shel shisha, shel shmona, right? He has a candelabra that's made of 5 or 6 or 8 different, arms of the menorah. That is not a violation. But shel shiva lo yaseh, but he should not make an exact duplicate of the menorah. Afilu shel shar minima tochos. Now here the Bryce is mechadish, an unbelievable chiddush, that even though the menorah was made of zav, he'd be chayev if he made a duplication of the menorah in another, let's say in silver. And I believe what the Gemara has in mind is that during the time of Bayis Sheni, the menorah was not made of gold, but rather was made of wood. Is Rabbi Yossi, Rabbi Yehuda disagrees. He says, Afshal eitz lo yase. You're telling me that you can't use another metal, and I'm sorry, that if you go ahead and use another metal like silver to make this candelabra, you violate the lav. But if it's made of wood, you're implying that there's no violation. No, no, no. Afshal eitz lo yase. This violation applies even if he makes a candelabra out of wood, because the second half of the base of the Bayis Sheni, meaning the Bayis Sheni stood for 400 years, let's say, 420 years, whatever. But for the last 200 years of the Bayis Sheni, when the Chashmonaim took over the Mikdash, they set up a menorah made of eitz, made of wood, as recorded in Zechariah Novi. Kiderech she'asu beis Chashmonaim. So since that's also Chaloshe menorah, therefore, if you duplicate it, you violate the lav lo tasuriti. Amru lo, the Chachamim rejected this shita of Rabbi Yossi, Rabbi Yehuda. Misham Raya, you bring a proof from the menorah in the Migdash Sheni. Shapudim shel Basil hayu. You think that the menorah in the second Migdash, after the time of the Chashmonaim and on, was made purely of wood? That's not so. You're making a mistake. It was made with spits of iron. In other words, the branches of the menorah had pieces of iron, and the wood was attached to the iron. Right? And they put another kind of metal on top of the wood, which is like a tin, which is called ba'atz. He'eshiru, and when they got wealthier, so I have to mention the Gemara at the end of Tainis. The Gemara at the end of Tainis says, why at the time of the Chashmonaim did they make the menorah out of wood? And the Gemara answers the wood was very cheap, inexpensive, and the people were suffering from poverty. The Jews couldn't afford to make a menorah out of zav. So they made a takana that they could make the zav out of wood. Heshiru. Then they got to the next level of wealth. They weren't so wealthy, but Asam shel kesef. So they went up to silver. So then the menorah was made of silver. Chazu veshu, when they get to the wealthiest, top financial status, then asam shel zav. Once again, they made it into gold. In any event, the bottom line for this whole discussion, that's why Abai is giving this, and the Gemara goes off on a detailed tangent of the different parts of the Mizbeach of the Beis Hamikdash, is because Abai wants to prove that this lav of lotasu iti only applies when you could create an exact duplicate, like parts of the Beis Hamikdash or kalim of the Beis Hamikdash, and that we're not allowed to do. You know that there's a menorah that they built on, it's called Machon HaMikdash, on the way to the Kotel. Have you ever seen it? I'm not 100% at home with it. I don't know exactly. So they claim that is the menorah that they're going to use in the Beis Hamikdash. I don't want to get into it. It's a lot of politics here, but I'm not sure that this is such an easy thing to do. In any event, but let's say, for example, says Abai, if they want to make images of the moon, which again, you cannot create an image of the moon that's an exact replica of the moon, obviously, and therefore that's not included in the Isa, and that's why Rav Shimon Gamliel was able to. Rav Gamliel was able to make these images of the moon. I just want to make a comment here that confuses my mind. The Gemara very often uses the term lislamed, meaning, if you're creating images of the moon for purposes of idolatry, that's one thing. But if you're creating images of the moon in order to learn and study the various, shapes of the moon as it grows through the month for Kiddush HaChodesh, I don't know why that would be awesome. But for some reason, the Gemara doesn't offer that answer. Are you telling me, Abaye, that if I cannot duplicate exactly those images that are up in Shamayim, the celestial beings, I'm allowed to create those images? Vatanya, we learned in the Brisa, Lo tasun itu, tasun kidmus shamosh, sham b'marom. This Brisa darshans that you're not allowed to create images of those servants of the Lord up in Shamayim, which includes all the celestial spheres. Which I mentioned yesterday to you, the famous painting called Starry Night, which has the moon. So now the Gemara is arguing, according to this price, so you're not allowed to make a picture of the moon.